Hello, welcome to another episode of Chasing Justice. I am your host, Synova Cantrell. It's been a while since we've released any true crime content. I apologize for that. We've had to pause our production and we're having some scheduling issues. I appreciate your patience. Today I'm alone on the mic, but I'm sure I can handle it. I have a very interesting case I would like to relate to you. It was actually sent to Synova Inc. Publishing by one of our guest bloggers. Thank you, Mr. Ian. He is wonderful. He has so much content on synovainc.com. I suggest you check him out. But it is the story and the murder of Brenda Bowen. Now, Brenda Bowen was married to a man named Jerry for 19 years, and she was last seen alive January 29th, 1997. Now, what happened to her is terrible and horrifying, but what happened after her ex-husband was convicted of her murder was even more insane. So this is quite the tale. I'm sure you guys will find it fascinating. So Brenda Bowen was 47 years old. She was married to Jerry Lee Bowen, who was 50 years old. They had been married 19 years. Everything seemed pleasant and good. They didn't have a rough marriage or anything. Everything seemed fine until close to 1995. The last few years, Jerry had started having an affair, and then he subsequently decided that he didn't want to be married anymore. So he moved out of the house and divorced Brenda. He gave Brenda and their teenage children most of the assets. He just basically wanted to walk away. And so he was living in a guest house on the property. Now, Jerry was actually a contractor, so he had his own business. He was financially stable, and Brenda herself was a real estate agent, so she was financially stable in her own right. And then together they had plenty. They were plenty affluent. Everything seemed fine. Brenda was a very avid churchgoer. They were very active. She was very active in the community. Everyone knew them and loved them, and everything seemed perfect and wonderful. But by 1995, Jerry was tired of it. And so he walked out and he gave Brenda everything and decided that he was done. Now, this would last less than 2 years. By January of 1997, he had come back to Brenda because his new girlfriend had spent all of his money and he found it was hard to survive financially. So he had come back to Brenda recently and asked her to remarry him to help him financially. And she had talked to some of her family and friends about this. No one knew exactly what she was going to say, but everyone tended to think she was going to say no. Now, this was 4 or 5 days before she disappeared. So we can guess what happened in that conversation. We don't have any actual proof of what happened in that conversation, but we do know she was last seen alive on January 29th, 1997. Her body wouldn't be found until 3 months later in the river. And her car was found just a few miles away in the woods. Her purse, her keys, and her cell phone were all inside. Now, they found it odd because Brenda was 5'2". Her husband was 6'1" to 6'3". I've heard different reports, but he was well over 6 foot tall. Now, when they found the car, they found it strange because there didn't seem any signs of struggle in the car, but the seat was pushed all the way back, and everybody knew that Brenda had to sit right up against the steering wheel to be able to reach the pedals. So that was the first kind of odd red flag. And then also, before they ever found Brenda's body, they of course interviewed Jerry because he's the ex-husband. He's still living on the property. They've had issues. So it would make sense for him to be interviewed, but what was strange was they was noticing that he was extremely calm. He seemed to really not care that she was missing. And he started speaking of her in past tense instantly. And when someone said that they think someone took her, she might be kidnapped, and he's like, oh no, she's dead. And they're like, well, how do you know this? And he's like, oh, I'm just assuming. But everything about his demeanor really pushed the law enforcement into looking into him deeper because everything he did seemed odd. Okay. Now, uh, it took them almost 2 years to actually convict him. It was in April of 2000. So I guess it was almost 3 years before he was finally convicted. But her body was found wrapped up in bed sheets from her home. It was tied up with nylon cords and they were in a bowline slip knot. Okay, I didn't know what that was, so I looked it up. And when I make the video for YouTube, I will edit in these pictures so you can see them. But this was the kind of knot. It's kind of a strange knot. It wasn't a simple over under double knot or anything like that. It was kind of an odd knot, and then the ends of the nylon rope were burnt. Now, this was a very specific knot that Jerry was known to use anytime he used nylon rope for anything. This was something that even his own son testified that, yes, my father uses this technique all the time. No, it's not a standard technique, but this is what he does, and he always burns the ends. And so this was something else, just something else circumstantial that kind of made you question Jerry again. Now, it was weighted, it was wrapped up in chains and concrete blocks, and it was supposed to stay in the river, but it came up and it was found 3 months later. Okay, so this was what was odd. It took them a little over a year or so to gather their case. Everything was circumstantial. He couldn't, he said things, he did things odd, those kinds of things. But then he also didn't have an alibi for his whereabouts. He would fall asleep in the middle of questioning. He would, nothing seemed to bother him. He didn't really care. And so, of course, he wasn't in any of the searches or anything. He was not concerned that the woman of his, that gave birth to his children was missing. He didn't seem to care at all. And so that just kept making them come back to him because they would get a list of suspects, they would, mark them all off, and then they would always end up back at Jerry's door asking him more questions. So by April of 2000, Jerry is actually going to stand trial for his wife's murder. They have no hard evidence. It's all circumstantial, but they find 21 witnesses, or 29, I think it's either 21 or 29 witnesses to testify of the strange things that Jerry has done and, just build their case. And this is the way they do it, through all these circumstantial things. Well, by the time this is all done, Jerry is convicted in the eyes of the media. Jerry's convicted in the eyes of the court. Jerry's convicted in everyone's eyes except for his own. He feels like they didn't have enough to convict him. He feels like he's wronged, and then somehow he's got it in his head that the police department's after him, and so somehow, because he has no record, even though he's convicted of murder, they let him out on bond for 2 months until it's time for sentencing. Now, why they did this, I don't know. This was the judge's decision. He let the guy go until sentencing time. Now, they obviously thought he was going to run, the police did, so they put somebody to kind of stake out and keep an eye on him. But nothing Jerry did really brought any attention to anybody. He didn't run off right away. He was seen in town doing his grocery shopping, buying gas, doing his normal things that he does. He made sure to not vary his external routine any. But during that time, he had spent many hours on the computer researching how to become a fugitive. And by the time it came around time for sentencing 2 months later, he was nowhere to be found. Now, they bust into his home, they look around, they, retrieve his computer, they find extremely graphic, pornographic, abusive to women, terrible things on his computer, over 5,000 searches for these things. And so that makes them even more nervous. But then they also find things that he has researched how to become a fugitive. And so they know they're in trouble. They start sending out flyers about the man. He's on the most wanted list. Um, and what's strange is they don't hear nothing about him. They don't get any further in the case until 4 years later. And then 4 years later, here he shows up. They've got him arrested, and he does this interview for the show called "I Almost Got Away with It." And that's when you find out how incredibly strange this case became. It wasn't bad enough that Brenda was killed. They believe she was suffocated and then tied up in her own bed sheets. It wasn't. I mean, that's bad enough. Um, but then to hear everything that this man went through, and how meticulous he was in his planning, um, it's scary because it was thinking if he hadn't slipped up in that one spot, he could have gone on for the rest of his life. And so that's what's so strange about this case. So how did he get away with it? How did this happen? How did this man evade capture for over 4 years? Um, and in reality, if he hadn't um, done one specific thing, he would have still been out there. And that's what's so scary. So he tells the story that he started researching how to get away from everything immediately, as soon as they arrested him, because he knew and he had supposedly been told that the police department was out to kill him, that they were going to, when they go to arrest him, they were going to take him in a body bag. There's no evidence that that was ever said or that was even thought of, but this was what was going on in Jerry's mind. He thought the police are going to kill me. So he reacts, and the way he does is by planning. So he decided he was going to go 1,500 miles away. This all happened in Alabama. He goes all the way to Reno, Nevada. Okay. And he starts looking and casing homeless men. And he starts befriending homeless men. And oh, let's go back. How does he get away? Okay. He knows he can't drive his own vehicle out of the city. They're going to know. Okay. So what he does is he slips out, dressed in a way he normally doesn't dress, and he slips out and buys a used car for real cheap with some cash. Okay. And then he stashes that so he can drive his truck to a normal place and then go get his car that the police don't know anything about. So that was how he got out of town. And then he goes all the way 1,500 miles away. He starts casing these poor homeless men who don't know what he's doing. He's very manipulative. He's very cunning. He's very charismatic, and so he's easily takes over. And he finds a man that looks similar to him in height, weight, age, hair color, eye color. He matches himself to somebody else. Then he cons them into a friendship so he can learn as much about them. He wants to make sure that they don't hold a job and they're not going to hold a job. He wants to make sure they're not connected to any family or friends that could find out about him. He has all these specific things that he's looking for in his target. Well, he finds the first guy. He ends up waiting until he passes out. He steals his driver's license and his social security card out of his stuff, and then he disappears. He goes into another state. He gets a driver's license, reciting all of this information that he had just stolen from this man. He gets his picture put on the driver's license. All the details match him physically. So now he's got somebody else's ID with his face on it. Okay, so now he goes and starts his life again. He builds up a new contracting business. He starts his whole life again. He lives there for 4 years, for a couple years. And then he starts getting nervous. He thinks, okay, this guy was in very bad health when I met him a couple years ago. He goes back and finds out that that man had died recently. So he starts the process all over again. Okay. He finds another man. He befriends another man. He steals another man's identity. Over the course of this time, he is doing something extremely graphic. And we don't find out about this until he's captured and he does that TV series, I Almost Got Away with It. I highly recommend you watch that. It's streaming on Amazon. You can watch it through Amazon Prime and Discovery or something like that. But anyways, he literally tries to do a procedure they call etching. Now, I had never heard this term. I knew people tried to damage their fingertips so you couldn't get a good fingerprint from them. But I never heard of it being called etching or done this way. He literally would he would pour a top of a can or something and a lid full of acid. And then he would hold his finger in it until he'd almost pass out from the pain. And then he'd lift it out. And he would do that repeatedly over and over again, literally burning the fingerprints from his fingers until but he still had to work, so he could only do one at a time. And so this is how determined this man was to not be found. And so he literally burns one finger after another repeatedly over and over and over, trying to burn off the fingerprints and leave nothing but scar tissue so you can't get a good print. It even goes into detail to where at one point in time, he literally burned his finger with acid to the point he killed the tip of his finger. It went too far. Somehow it seeped into the tissue and it literally killed the tip of his finger. So then he's in a crisis. He can't live like that. He's got to get that taken care of. So he goes into the hospital under his alias, and he builds up the story about getting hurt on the job, which we know he's a contractor, so he makes up something. And so the story, the TV series, I Almost Got Away with It, goes into detail about his anxiety levels and all this stuff. And quite frankly, I don't care about his anxiety levels. I'm looking at a man that's so bent on not getting caught for something he says he didn't do, not getting caught, that he is literally to burn his fingers off. And so he literally goes in the hospital and he invents a lie and is real careful not to show him the rest of his hands or anything because he doesn't want to see what he's been doing to his fingers. And so anyways, he makes it through that. Where he messes up by the end, by the end of all of this, he has literally been on the run for 4 years. They haven't had any tips on this man whatsoever. He literally vanished. Now, if he had stayed where he was or stayed up north, he would have been fine. Instead, he goes to South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is a state away from Alabama, so he thought he was okay. But he starts up a relationship with a woman. And the relationship was okay. It broke off, but this woman's best friend always had a bad feeling about the man she knew as Scott. Now, when America's Most Wanted decided to re-air the Brenda Bowen story, she happened to see it this time. And she called into the authorities and said, hey, I know that the man my sister was seeing, we know him as Scott Starbuck, but I believe he's your Jerry Bowman. So they bring him in, he finally confesses, and the story's over. So I want to ask you, he says he felt like the police were after him and that he was innocent and that they trumped up all these charges against him. Let me ask you, do you think Jerry Bowman killed his wife and then burnt his fingertips off, took advantage of two homeless men, and countless others, no telling how many people he took advantage of. Do you think he did all of that because he was innocent? Or do you think he did all of that because he killed his wife and he was trying to get away with it? I'll leave that up to you. I hope you've enjoyed this story. I'll see you later in the next video. Bye-bye.